business continuity during disaster for Azure SQL database. So we'll be exclusively talking about Azure SQL database now. I'm fully aware that Azure SQL database encompasses Azure SQL database with PaaS, SQL Server managed instance, and also hyperscale. For the interest of time, we will just focus on Azure SQL database in PaaS model for today's talk. So let's move on. I'm not going to read my bio, but if you want to take a note of my contacts at the left, please take a note. If you have any question, comments after this session, you can always follow up with me. I will share all the code and the slides in my GitHub repo. So you do not need to take any note. You can download, edit, use it as you see fit. Now, why would you listen to this talk, right? This is a Saturday in East Asia, it's a time for people to probably have some downtime, enjoy after a whole week of work. And what is the reason for people to listen to me for an hour, right? So if you are working with Azure SQL database and if you're a production database, this is a true example that in UK South region, there were a downtime or an outage for some of the resources, and it was out for almost 16 hours. So the question for you that you should ask yourself and to your business owners, can they sustain an outage for 16 hours, right? And if the answer is no, then this talk will help you out. I'll show you some of the stuff that you can do when there is an outage like this, that you can bring your resources up in a different data center, in a different region, or we also talk about zone, right? So I'll show you a couple of different ways to do that. Now, I showed you an example, and that's not the only one. This is, you can check out by yourself from that URL, and if you filter just by Azure SQL database, you can see all the outages that happened in last 2 years. The recent one was just in July, and if you look at the timing on the top line here, it started at 3:47 UTC and finished at 13:30. It's almost a 10-hour outage, right? So again, it's a question that you need to decide along with your business partners and system owners, business owners. Can you sustain this kind of outage? If not, hopefully this talk is going to help you. So before we dive into, I just want to talk about two terms. You might be familiar with these two. It's called RPO and RTO, right? Recovery time objective and recovery point objective. And if you do not know, you definitely want to familiar yourself. And I'll mention that over and over during this talk. But there's another term called ERT, which is called estimated recovery time. This is a comparatively new term compared to RTO, RPO. You should also be aware of this term. And what does this mean? So when we are designing an application in Azure, the database is not the only component, right? You have other components. You have network components, you have app servers, you have probably storage, and all kind of resources. So you need to check, or you need to decide your RTO based on the recovery time for each component, right? So you look at the recovery time for each of the services, and you take the one that is going to take you the longest time to recover, and that should be your official RTO. That's the one you want to publish, because it doesn't matter. You can probably recover some of the services within 5-6 minutes, but there may be services that will take you longer time. So it doesn't help you just recovering one component and not the other ones, because your application cannot recover. So officially, you should always publish the longest one. And you want to have those discussions before a disaster happened, right? With your system owners, with your app owners, or whatever you call them. This is more of a visual slide. What do I mean by RPO, RTO? Now, there is a point that can be controversial, or that people might have difference of opinion on that. Because sometimes we might have a disaster that we might not know right away, and we might not start recovery till you know that something wrong happened. So, I'll give you an example. Um, Say today is Saturday in most of the places. If we do a deployment tonight, and say we deleted some records or we did an update, and we did not notice that right away, right? So we did the release, it was successful, we are all happy. Say like Monday morning, the business opens and someone in your office was trying to do some work and they realize that the data doesn't make sense, and then they report to you. You go back and check that, okay, there was a predicate probably was missing or was not written correctly during the deployment. Now, so the disaster actually happened on Saturday, but you didn't know about that till Monday morning. So sometimes, that can happen, and you want to make it clear to your counterparts that your RPO RTO is actually will be counted when you get a request for recovery, right? Not from the time the disaster happened, because you might not know when did that happen, right? So you want to have those discussions beforehand. So let's move on. So before we dive into some of the techniques that we can deploy for disaster recovery and high availability, you also need to know what are the possibilities or what are the options that you have in order for you to deploy Azure SQL Database. Now, I'm not going to read this slide. I'm not going to memorize this. This is all available on Microsoft documentation. The reason you need to know, because some of the solutions that I'm going to show you today is not available for all of this purchase model, service tier, compute tier, and hardware type. Some solutions are only available for certain kind of deployment. That's why you don't want to deploy first and then look at the solutions that you want to deploy for HADR. You probably want to do it backward, means you first want to decide what kind of HADR solutions you want to deploy, and then work back to see what kind of database that you want to deploy. Now, I mentioned here the DTU and vCore. So I'll probably talk for a minute about these two models. So when Microsoft first deployed Azure SQL Database, the only option we had was the DTU model. And then later on, Microsoft came out with the vCore model. And currently, if you go and read the books online or documentation, you'll see that Microsoft recommend the vCore model. Does that mean that if you have a DTU model, you need to change everything to vCore model? Probably no. If you're happy, you can leave it as is. In the DTU model, the biggest complaint or the biggest concern people had this, once you deployed Azure SQL Database in DTU model, you really didn't know how many CPU memory or how much memory you are getting, right? This is abstract. So this is abstract of your compute, storage, and your IO. So, these are all bundled together. And it was abstract unit, they call this database transaction unit. But in vCore model, you can clearly see how many CPU you get and how much memory you get allocated per CPU. So it's a little bit more more visible resource-wise. So and Microsoft's current recommendation is a vCore. So enough of that. So we're going to dive into the topic right now. So we're going to talk about redundancy. And when we talk about redundancy, we're going to talk about a couple of different sections. Now, the sections from the second one is pretty clear, right? Data center, zone, region, and geography. And I'll talk about a little bit more about what do I mean by zone. But why did I put deployment as in the redundancy group? The reason I put this in Azure, right? The main advantage, one of the main advantages in Azure, that we can always deploy resources on demand, right? We can deploy resource, do our work, we can destroy it, we can shut it down, we can deploy again. So you always want to do the deployment not from the GUI every time and click, 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 right? You will probably want to use some script. There are something called ARM template, and there are many other ways you can do from from DevOps pipeline. So what I mean by that, you want to have some system built in or some scripts beforehand, some mechanism that you can deploy a resource over and over, but with the same configuration, right? So that's what I mean by redundancy. So we'll talk. I'm not going to talk about deployment anymore, but I will touch the other four. Now, what are the methods that I'll be talking about. So these are the 6 now. You might be scratching your head, or you might be wondering that why did I put uh, temporal table here, right? Is temporal table really a solution? So temporal table really is not a solution by itself, but if you have it turned on, and if you have issue with data, you can go back in time and look at some of the older versions of the data, right? And there's not really much difference between on-premises and in cloud. So I'm not going to talk about this, but you still want to see, check out the tier that you are deploying your Azure SQL database, and there are some restrictions around temporal table on some of the different kind of objects within the SQL Server database. So you might want to check that out before you rely on temporal table. And I'm not going to talk about that anymore. So let's move on to the backup. But before I go to the backup, I just want to give you a sample here that some people might be happy with just the backup, and we'll talk more about that. But you want to show that to the people. Hey, if you just want to rely on your backup as your disaster recovery solution, of course you don't have a high availability if you just rely on backup, but your RTO is a 12 hours. So if a region is down, and if you have to bring up a SQL server in a different region, and you want to back up from your existing backups, it might take 12 hours, and you might be losing 1 hour of data. And if the owners are okay, then that's fine. It's a cheaper solution. So what do you do? If they say that no, this is not, this is not optimal for us, and we are not happy with it, then you have to show them the other solutions, right? The auto failover groups, active geo application. You can show them those, but those are a little bit more expensive. So just keep that in mind. As your RTO, RPO is reducing, you have to dish out more money. So with the backup, as soon as you deploy Azure SQL database, they automatically start getting backup without you doing anything. And one note I put here that you lose control of precise RPO. What do I mean by that? So let's go further. This is a quote from SQL Server documentation. And if you look at this, I put some stuff in yellow. It says that you cannot change the schedule of the backup, right? So on premises, I can schedule a transaction log backup at an exact date and time, but I cannot do the same in Azure SQL database. Why not? If you look at this, and this is also from the documentation, it says that the full backup happens on a weekly basis. Differential happens between 12 and 24 hours. Transaction log happens between 5 and 10 minutes. It doesn't tell me when the differential backup is taken. Like on premises, I can back it up exactly at 9 p.m. Here, I cannot do that. I don't have a control. I cannot schedule a transaction log backup exactly at certain minute and second. What I can do in on premises. So that's what I meant by you lose the exact control on this. What do you get by default? You get 7 days of point-in-time backup, and you can increase that up to 35 days, except in the basic tier. And I'll show you all this during the demo. Now, for some businesses, including where I work as a full-time employee for an investment management firm, 35 days backup retention is not enough. From the Federal Trade Commission, we have requirements to keep our data for a longer period, because they can come sometime and audit us, and they want to see a certain trade and they want to see the details, right? That's why we need to keep our data for longer. And I'm sure some of you are in the business that you need to keep your backups longer than 35 days. For those people, Microsoft also have a solution that your data can be retained in the backup for 10 years. You can schedule it for weekly, monthly, and yearly, and we'll see some of this during the demo. What can you do with the backup? You can restore in existing logical server. You can overwrite a database. You can restore with a different name. You can restore in a different region in case of a disaster. And you can also restore from your long-term backup with a different name. One thing, you cannot overwrite an existing database during the restore, of course. So, and other thing that you need to keep in mind, if you delete your database, you can always restore from point in time backup. If you delete the server, the logical server, your all point in time backups get deleted. So you cannot restore from point in time. Your only option will be going to the long-term retention. And just remember, in the long-term retention, the smallest granularity is a weekly. So you need to keep that in mind. I get this question all the time. Do we get integrated checks with these backups from Azure? Yes. Azure claims they, Microsoft claims they do test restore, DVC check, DV checksum. Some of this doesn't happen in managed instance. So if you're using managed instance, please look up books online. I also get this question, can you restore these backups on premises? No, not directly. You cannot do that, but some of the tools that I listed here, you can leverage some of these tools and try to reconstruct your database in the on-premises environment. I'll leave it at that. I'm not going to go into any further details on these tools. So the next one, so what we talked about right now is we are just absolutely relying on backup. We are not doing anything. But if you read the documentation, Microsoft also claims that Microsoft give you a built-in HADR whenever you deploy Azure SQL database. What do I mean by that? I mean that just by deploying it, you get some redundancy within the data center. So if the data center goes down, you have some redundancy there. Or if there is an issue with certain components within a data center. And I'll show this in the demo, but I'll also show you some slides how Microsoft does that. So if you're deploying in basic, standard, or general purpose tier, the way this design works, and it's pretty much pretty similar to what we know on premises as a failover cluster instance. As you can see from this picture, we have shared storage. So our data and log file is sitting in storage, and we have our compute with the SSD, right? Where you see the primary replica. So if there is a problem with that server or that VM, your data and log file is not getting impacted because it's not attached to it, right? It only has SSD, which has temp DB and some configuration data. So if there is a problem, so with the stateless compute here, and the service fabric recognize that there is the issue, it will fail you over to a different node with the spare capacity, as you can see on the right. But before it does the failover, what it's going to do is going to detach your data and log file, fail you over. It will find some spare capacity with the compute, and it will start a SQL Server.exe. Once the SQL Server engine is running, it is going to attach your data and log file again, and you are back into business. And we'll see this in action. This takes a little bit more time compared to premium tier because you have to detach and attach the log file. And if you look at that slide, it says the LRS. So these are locally redundant. So your data and log file actually getting copied to a different storage in case if this storage goes south, so it can bring up from there. And then you have your backup file, which is getting geographically redundant, so it's getting copied to other region too. The connection redundancy, the connection redirection is a built-in. You do not have to do anything, and I'll show that during the demo. If you're in business, premium and business critical tier, pretty much same, but it looks like more of always an availability group compared to failover cluster instances, because here you have multiple copies of your data and log files. So they're constantly getting copied to 3 other secondary replicas. So here we do not have to do the detach and attach. So it's a lot faster for the failover, and it's automatic. You do not do this manually. Microsoft controls it. So the service fabric constantly monitoring this, and if it sees the issue, it will initiate the failover automatically. One thing here, you might be wondering that which node it is going to fail over. So in this configuration in premium and business critical tier, at least one node is always sync with your primary, and that's the one that it will get failed over. And this is very quick. We'll see this during the demo. So this is a redundancy within the data center, right? So next we move to the zone redundancy. And what do I mean by the zone? So in a bigger regions, say like East US 2 or some of the other bigger regions, what Microsoft does, they actually create 3 different zones within a region. And what's a zone? So a zone means it has its own network, it has own power, own cooling, and all that. And if it recognizes that you have a problem within a data center or within a zone here, it will fail you over to a second or third zone. And in general purpose here, this is disabled by default. It will cost you additional cost if you turn on zone redundancy. And you also want to remember that your response to your request to the database might increase a little bit more, because now it has to, uh, you know, keep the zones in sync, keep your data in sync between the different zone. And here you see the same thing. The data and log file is going to get detached, and it's going to fail over, and then it's going to get attached again. So again, the service fabric is going to control all of this. One thing you want to notice that I have a bullet point here that it is only available with Gen 5 compute hardware. And this is one of the reasons that I was telling you before, that you do not want to deploy and then come back and decide what kind of solution you want. Because if you did not want deploy in Gen 5 hardware, and then later on you want to the zone redundancy or out of luck. So you want to do it other way. You want to keep that in mind. From premium and business critical tier, same concept, except your data and log file is attached to your compute. So your data and log file is constantly getting copied to other zones. And here again, it's default, disabled by default, but it does not cost you extra money like general purpose. If you turn this on, it is not going to cost you extra money for business premium and business critical tier, because you're already paying a higher price for that. And your latency is going to increase because now you are in a synchronous replication to at least to one of the zones, right? So you want to keep that in mind. I'm going to take a pause here just to check if anyone has any question up to this point. Can you see the questions, if anything, on the Facebook Live?
No, yet not. I haven't seen any question.
Okay, so I'll move on.
Okay.
Because if anyone
Taiob, are you are muted? Taiob, you have muted.
Yeah,
Please,
sorry about that.
Taiob, can please unmute.
Yeah, sorry about that. So I'm going to go back. So before I move further, I want you to, this is a URL for another document that published by Microsoft. It has detailed SLA for each tier, talking about the SLA with zone redundancy turned on and turned off. You definitely want to consult this, take it to system owner, business owner, talk to them, and agree to the solutions that you don't wait for a disaster to agree on your RPO, RTO. So the next one we're going to talk about is active geo replication. What do I mean by that? So we talked about data center redundancy, we talked about zone redundancy. Now we are talking about a region-wise outage, right? So if the whole region, say like East US2 goes down, or like the Singapore region goes down, what do you do? In this case, you can set up, and this is a manual setup. You have to set it up. I mean, when I say manual, you can do it through script, which you'll see with the PowerShell. But you have to do this beforehand, right? It's not a built-in. So you bring up another server on a secondary region, and then you constantly replicate your data. So this is at a database level. This is not a group of database. This is a asynchronous replication. You can do up to 4 secondaries in different region. And you can also use these secondaries for read-only traffic. So if you have reports and if you have read-only traffic, you can redirect those to the secondary, and you can reduce the burden on your primary node. Now, I talked about asynchronous replication. So how does that work? So one thing you are guaranteed by Microsoft that you're never going to get partial transaction, right? Because it used the snapshot isolation. So for one transaction, it's either fully committed or it's not to your secondary. You never get half-baked transactions on your secondary. Now, a question I get asked, if I have a very important transactions that I definitely want to make sure that it get hardened into the secondary, what I can do, I can take advantage of this store procedure. But be careful using it, because the more you use it, your response to the caller is going to get delayed, right? Because now you have to wait for the transactions to get hardened to the secondary, then only you get the acknowledgement back. So use it wisely, right? Don't use it everywhere that you do not need. So active geo-replication, as you can see from this picture, it works at a database level, right? I have a single database. Now, if I have multiple databases that I want to fail over, what's my option? The other problem with active geo-replication is you have to manage your connection string. So once you fail over, you have to go and change your connection string. But Azure SQL database also started using alias recently. So if you're using an alias, you can go to your DNS and just change your alias pointing to the new server, but you still have some manual steps. So if you have multiple databases and you want the auto redirection of your connection, there's something called auto failover group. Here you can bundle multiple databases the same way we do on premises for always an availability group. You can do something like that, or you can do similar to that. But you also get listeners, and these listeners, there are two different types. One is a read-write listener and one is a read-only listener. So if you use these listeners in your connection string, once you fail over, you do not have to do anything. So the listeners are automatically going to redirect you to the correct node, and we'll see how to do that. So that's how your listener names look like, right? So you have your failover group name, database.windows.net, and for your read-only traffic, you get a .secondary.database.windows.net. When you set up this auto failover groups, there's a setting called grace period with data loss hours. I absolutely urge you to read about this and understand before you set this up, right? So this can play a major role how your failover will work. So this will take you to a blog post that I wrote after having multiple email conversations with Microsoft engineers, because I was not very clear. And there was some confusion in the documentation, which we also fixed in this exercise. So you want to read that and make sure you understand before you set this up. This is a chart that I created just so you know what's the difference between a geo-replication and auto failover groups, what you get, what you don't get, just to give you a better idea. So I'm not going to read this. This is mostly for your reference. I get this question all the time, that how do I check my replication status? So this is a query. This is a query that I copied from Microsoft documentation. There's nothing fancy. That gives you your latency. So I talked about a few times that you want to talk to your application owners and talk to your system owners about your RPO RTO, right? So these are some of the questions that I listed just to give you a starting point. And this is not a comprehensive list. If you can think of something else to do, send to me, and I'll add this to the slide. So we're going to go to the demo right now, and I'll demo some of the stuff that I talked about. If you have any question, please put it in the chat, and I can answer some of those. And if you see any question in the Facebook Live, just stop me or read the questions, and I can answer those. So we have about 20 minutes. Should be enough for the demo. So before all of you came online, I actually ran some of this code, and I'm going to share all this later on just to save some time. So the demo will start here. So you might be asking the question that, what did I deploy, right? So let me show you this. Uh, so these are some of the resources that are deployed, right? I have 3 SQL Server, I have 2 database, and they're in different tiers. I have a database in the primary here, and we'll set up some of this stuff with the secondary and then really scale out. So that's all I have for now. And so let's start from here. So we talked about backup, right? So let's see what kind of backup retention we get by default. So if we go to the portal, probably easier to show you here. If we go to the backup and we go to the retention policy, you can see here that we got point in time just for 7 days, right? And we have a diff backup for 12 hours. We do not have any long-term retention backup, right? By default. Oh, and if I go here, I click this, I configure. I told you I can slide it up to 35 days, except basic tier, right? So I can go up to here. I can also set up long-term retention from here, but I'm going to do it from the PowerShell. Everything I'm going to do is using PowerShell. So you can repeat this, but you can also do most of this stuff on the GUI if you want. So here we're going to set up long-term retention. What we are saying is that weekly backup is a keep it for 12 weeks. The yearly retention is 5 year. Now, what's the yearly retention, right? It can be confusing. What we are saying is the 16th week is the yearly backup, right? So keep the 16th week backup for 5 years. So let's run this. And if we go to the portal, now you see that I have a long-term retention, right? My weekly backup, 12 weeks, yearly backup, keep week 16 for 5 years. And you set it up, whatever way you need to. We can check the long-term retention. If you want to remove the long-term retention, you can do it using this command. I'm not going to run this right now for the interest of time. After backup, we talked about built-in HADR, right? So if you go to the portal right now, and if you look at the primary server, and I have a database, and if you go to replicas, you can see that I haven't set up anything. I haven't set up active geo replication. I haven't set up any failover groups, nothing. But without doing any of this, we also get built-in told you a few times, right? So let's look at that in action. I'm going to use a tool called Ostress. This is also written by Microsoft. I also put an URL. You can download this. Ostress, we can put some workload. Can it be possible to keep backup in data lake? I think you mean by data lake. No, you cannot. You cannot. Microsoft takes care of the backend. For Azure SQL database in the past model, you cannot change the destination of the backup. No, you do not have any control over that. So the question was, can it be possible to keep the backup in data lake? Okay, so now I'm going to take this command and we'll just mimic an application, right? And then we'll do a okay. So now this is reading the data. Yes, Siva, I think it meant data lake. So it's not data lake. I think it's just a typo. So now assume that this is reading and our application is working. And now if there is a disaster, we are not going to do this manually. This is just for test purpose. Microsoft, the server fabric Service Fabric will recognize that there is a problem and they will issue this command for a failover. So let's see what happened. So there's a failover happening. We get timeout error. And within a couple of seconds, you will see that we'll start reading again. You see that we are back. So this is built in without us doing anything, right? And if you come here, if you see that this happened within 16 seconds, right? We didn't have to do anything. So this is built in. And if you are in general purpose, it will probably take you a little bit longer because it has to detach the data and log file, and then it has to go and attach it again, right? We talked about that. So let's look at a built-in. Sorry, not the built-in, active geo replication. So we can see that here we do not have anything, right? We do not have any replica. We haven't set up anything. So now we're going to set up a active geo replication for the database. We're going to use another server in the secondary region, right? So now if we come here, it's not done yet. Now, as you can see, we have a primary in East US. We also have a secondary in West US, right? And this is seeding. So the data is now getting synced to the secondary server with the same database name. Once that is done, we can also do a planned failover, right? To failover to the secondary. So right now you see that the primary is in East US, right? So still seeding the data. That's why it's taking a little bit longer. If we refresh it, yeah. And once this is done, as I said before, you can use these secondaries for your read-only traffic once the seeding is done. Taking a little bit longer than I expected. This is a pretty tiny database. That's the problem with the live demo that, okay, so now it's available, it's readable. Okay. So it got caught up, right? Now, if I want to do a failover, I can use this command. And now we should see the roles change. I don't understand the question. Is the recovery model, do you mean, is it synchronous or asynchronous replication? Is that the question? Okay. Now you see that, yeah, go ahead.
So far, my understanding is he want to align it with always on synchronizer and asynchronous mechanism.
Okay, so I'm not really following the question, but this is asynchronous replication, as I said when I was presenting the slides. This is not a synchronous replication. And you cannot switch that. So now the primary is in West US and the secondary is in East US. But as we are failing over manually and in a controlled failover, so I think everything is going to get copied. So you're not going to lose anything. And if you want to fail back, this is another command you can use. It's a set database. Secondary is the same thing. You just tell that which one you want it to be to fail over to. Now here we see that we are doing it at a database level, right? But as I said, if you have multiple databases that you want to group together and you want to fail over with the transactionally consistent, then what you can do something called failover group, right? Right now we do not have any failover group, but let's come here. So you're going to create a failover group. And we are not adding any database at this point. We are just creating the empty failover group. Once you create a failover group, then you can add and drop databases. This is the switch that I was talking about. Grace period with data loss hours. The minimum is an hour. So now we have a failover group. Grace period 120 minutes. We do not have any database yet here, right? But we know that our primary is in East US, our secondary is in West US, and these are the listeners that we talked about before when I was showing you the slide. So you should take this connection strings and depending on whoever does this in your company, you should send it to them so they can put those in the connection string. So in case of a failover or failback, your transactions are automatically going to get redirected to the right server. So we're going to add a database to the failover group. And if we come here, this is unfortunate, they don't have a refresh button here. Now you can see here we have a database count means 1 of 1, right? So what does that mean? As you can see here, it is getting replicated, right? And if we come to here, we can see that we have a database named SQL database 1004. It is synced, it's readable, right? And now we can do a failover. So if we come here, just remember, see that, so let's go back here. The primary is in East US and the secondary is in West US. Now let's do a planned failover. We can also do forced failovers if we need to. And hasn't changed yet. Yes, it's changed now. So now you see the primary is in West US and the secondary is in East US, right? We did failover. So now the replication is on a reverse order. And if you want to see the details about a failover group, this is just a command to give you more info. What are the databases is a part of your failover group or not? I mentioned about read scale out. I know this is not a part of the disaster recovery or high availability solution, but since I mentioned it, I also have some code here. If you want to check out the read scale out, you can do that. So, but I'm not going to do it right now for the interest of time. I already see the next speaker is probably here, so I'm going to try to wrap up so the next speaker can do some setup and I can take some questions. So these are the resources that you can read more. I know there is a lot, but there is also a lot to consider. So I try to put as much as possible so you can read more before you make a decision that, what solutions you need. Here you can download the slide and the demo code. I'll also send the location to the organizer so they can put it in the as the comment in the meeting details. Here are my contacts again. In case if you have any question, comments later on once you download the material, if you try to set this up in your own portal account, if you run into any issues, you can always reach out to me. So I want to thank you again for joining. Thanks the organizers for doing this. I'll hang out here. Um, uh, so if you have any questions, comments, I'll take those.
So, you have more 10 minutes you have on hand. Actually, your session is 1 hour. If you want to share something within 10 minutes, you can.
Yeah, I mean, I can, show you, what I
Next
mean
session
by.
will be start at 7 p.m. actually.
Oh, I understand. I thought, if there are question answers and if the other speaker needs some setup, so I didn't want to be
No,
overrun. But
Andrew will start from 7 p.m.
it's
actually.
it's okay.
Thank you very
It's okay.
much.
Plenty of time. Please go ahead. Any questions anyone has for you, please go ahead. I'm still setting up.
Yeah, no worries. So let's see, when I say read scale out, right? What do I mean by that, right? So if you see that this is just a one server, right? It's the same server we created. If we go to the portal, because this is in a business critical tier, right? We automatically get built-in HADR. I mean, for every tier, but with this one, the advantage is we can use the secondaries as a read-only traffic without paying any extra money. Now, if we go to the connection strings, we see that we have this application intent equals read-only. And now, if we execute this, you see the database is in read-only mode. What is that telling us? That now I'm really pointing to a different server than my primary node, right? Because my primary node is read-writable, right? Because I'm reading and writing. And now, if I have another connection string without this, I take this out and connect. But I'm still pointing to the same server. I have it read-write. And now I'm pointing to the read-write node. So even though I have the same name, underneath, there are more than one server because it's getting replicated, and I can take advantage of it without paying any extra money. I know this is not related to HADR, but this is something you get if you are deploying into premium and business critical tier. So you should take advantage of that, right? You're not paying any extra money. You have all these nodes with compute power sitting on. So if you have, reports, analytical queries that someone is running, you can redirect them over there. Okay, so I will, I'll end here. Give a break to the attendees if they want to grab a drink or something, or take questions. So I'll be staying here, till Andrew starts. If you have any question, comments, put it here, and we can discuss.
So, but there is a question that can you please give an idea about the cost involvement?
Cost involvement. I cannot give you an idea about cost involvement because it all depends. If you remember the slides that we talked about, it will all depend on, how do I, what I'm deploying, right? And on top of that, it will depend on how many CPU, how much storage I'm allocating. And then if you're talking about active geo replication, now I need two same size databases. So my expense is going to go twice. And then there'll be some charge for traffic in, not for out. For your IO, you'll incur a little bit more charge. So it all depends, right? What tier you are deploying, what size your database is, how many CPUs you are allocating. You can have 2 CPUs, you can have 40 CPUs. So it's kind of hard to, really, but Microsoft also, don't make this a secret, right? So it's pretty. So if you go here, just for this database, it actually gives you some idea here how much you might be spending, right? And if you see this, I slide this, see the dollar amount, right?
Right.
So it's 39,000 versus 1,000. So it's hard for me to give you any number. It doesn't work. You have to figure this out by yourself. That's why I don't talk about numbers, right? And then your price is going to change. You change this, it's $14. You go to, I don't know, like here. It's $993. So as you can see, you can go from $14 to $40,000, right, per month. So you really have to figure this out by yourself. And then there's something called reserve instance in Azure. So if you're sure that you need a resource for a longer period of time, you can pay in advance for a year, for 3 years, and you get a huge percentage discount on that.
Okay.
Anything else?
Another question is that if he asked if he wants to use Azure Synapse in that context, can he take the backup, move the backup from this region to his data lake?
Sorry, I'm not following. So can you take backup from Azure SQL database or?
Actually সে জিজ্ঞেস করতে যাচ্ছে যে এই যে ব্যাকআপটা হচ্ছে সেই ব্যাকআপটা কি সে ডাটা লেক স্টোরেজে রাখার কোনো মেকানিজম আছে?
No, I answered that before. You cannot take the backup, built-in backup, and copy it to Azure Data Lake. No, you cannot do that. You cannot move these backups. You cannot download these backups. You can only restore from these backups to another Azure SQL database. That's all you can do.
Okay, I think he has got his answer.
Yeah, you can manually extract this data with some of the tools that I showed you. You can manually extract the schema. You can extract the data and you can try to reconstruct it in a different environment using some of the tools that I showed you in this slide. But we just don't have time to talk about this in this, because of time. You can use many of these tools to extract and recreate it. So yeah, so it's already 9 p.m. So thank you very much. Let's listen to Andrew. And I again thank you to all attendees and the organizers.
Thank you, Taiob. Thank you very much for your nice presentation. Hope it will be very much useful for the audience, for business, for their own